On May 12, 2011, 2 months after a 9.0 magnitude earthquake tore open the seafloor off Japan's northeast coast and sent a wall of water crashing into the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, the Japanese government issued an order. Every farm animal left behind inside the evacuation zone was to be killed. Contaminated meat could never reach a market, a truck, or a dinner table. A cattle rancher named Masami Yoshizawa broke through the barricades anyway, driving back into a town he was legally forbidden to enter, to check on the herd he had left behind. What he found stayed with him for the rest of his life. Cattle reduced to skin and bone, bellowing for water nobody was coming to bring. Pigs, abandoned in their pens, starving so badly they had started attacking each other. Yoshizawa refused to let his own cattle be destroyed. He stayed. He built a fence, painted a sign that read Ranch of Hope, and dared the government to come take his herd by force. They never did. But Yoshizawa's cattle were never going to be the story that defined this land. Something else had already slipped past the barricades, something with no rancher to protect it, and no fence strong enough to hold it back. And in less than 2 years, that something would turn one of the most heavily guarded, most radioactive stretches of ground on Earth into the site of one of the strangest wildlife takeovers in modern history. Here's what the numbers looked like before anyone understood what was coming. The earthquake and the tsunami that followed killed close to 18,000 people. More than 150,000 residents were evacuated from a ring roughly 20 kilometers wide around the wrecked reactors, a zone officials called the difficult-to-return zone, a name that turned out to be more literal than anyone intended. Homes were left mid-morning, breakfast dishes still in the sink, laundry still on the line. Some residents had less than an hour's notice before buses arrived to take them out of the zone, for what officials promised, at the time, would be a short-term precaution. Most were told to bring only what they could carry in their hands. Nobody boarding those buses imagined they were leaving for good. Rice paddies went unharvested. Vegetable gardens kept growing with nobody to pick them. For the animals that already lived in the hills and forests surrounding those towns, this wasn't a disaster. It was an invitation. Picture it the way the researchers who first walked back in describe it. Vending machines still humming on street corners with nobody left to buy anything from them. Traffic lights cycling red to green to red, for an audience of nobody, block after block, year after year. Fishing boats rotting at anchor in harbors nobody was allowed to enter. A supermarket with produce still on the shelves, decomposed down to dust, untouched, because nobody was left to loot it, and nothing alive nearby understood what a supermarket even was. Rice paddies that used to be flooded on a strict irrigation schedule kept flooding on their own, turning into shallow wetlands almost by accident. Within a single growing season, land that had been managed by human hands for centuries started behaving like it never had been. And into that quiet, animals that had spent generations staying just out of sight, in the tree line, past the edge of the last field, started walking forward instead of holding back. Wild boar had always lived in the mountains above the Fukushima coastline, the same way they live across most of rural Japan. Before 2011, they were managed the ordinary way, hunted for meat, culled when they raided a farmer's field, kept in check by a human population that had every reason to push back whenever the animals came too close. That pressure vanished overnight. Hunters evacuated along with everyone else. Farms that used to mean danger for a boar sniffing around the edge of a field became empty land with unharvested crops sitting in the open, and nobody was left to shoot anything. The boars did what any animal does when the two forces holding its population down, predation and starvation, both disappear at the same time. They multiplied. Within 2 years, sightings inside the zone had already tripled. By the third year, hunting teams working to control the population had culled 13,000 wild boar across the prefecture in a single year, more than 4 times the number killed annually before the disaster. And that wasn't a ceiling. Later counts showed the population climbing further still, more than 330% higher than it had been just a few years before. Nobody released these animals into the zone. Nobody had to. Everyone else just left, and the boars walked in on their own. That's the sentence you need to hold on to, because everything that follows only makes sense once you understand it. Nobody released the boars. Everyone else just left. Boar were not the only animals to notice the vacancy. Troops of Japanese macaques moved down out of the mountains and into abandoned vegetable plots, raising infants in gardens nobody was tending anymore. Raccoon dogs, a native species related to foxes, expanded into neighborhoods where they had never dared to live before, denning under porches and inside the crawl spaces of houses left to rot. Feral dogs, pets left behind in the panic of the evacuation, formed loose packs that roamed the empty streets for years before slowly being caught or dying out, their numbers occasionally caught on camera by the handful of journalists allowed inside. Rat colonies exploded inside abandoned homes with nobody left to set a trap or leave out poison. For a few strange years, the exclusion zone functioned less like a contaminated wasteland and more like an accidental nature reserve, one nobody had designed, filling itself in with whatever species happened to be closest when the fences went up. But of everything that moved into the vacuum, nothing adapted faster, bred harder, or caused more damage once people started trying to come back than the wild boar. Now here's where the story gets strange enough that even the researchers studying it needed a minute to process what they were looking at. When geneticists began sampling wild boar populations across Fukushima and the surrounding Tohoku region years after the disaster, they expected to find ordinary Japanese wild boar, the same animal that had lived in those hills for centuries. What they found instead, in a small but consistent slice of the population, was something else entirely. 18 of the boars they sampled carried a genetic marker that had no business being there, a mitochondrial signature belonging to European domestic pigs. Somewhere in the chaos of the evacuation, farm pigs had escaped their pens, wandered into the forest, and successfully bred with wild boar. The hybrids looked, to the untrained eye, almost exactly like ordinary wild boar, but underneath the skin, they were carrying a genetic advantage their wild cousins didn't have. Wild boar breed seasonally, tied to the rhythm of the forest, a few litters spaced carefully across the year. Domestic pigs, bred by humans for centuries to maximize output, breed year-round with no seasonal breaks at all. When researchers traced the reproductive patterns of the Fukushima hybrids, they found that trait had carried straight through the crossbreeding. Each generation, the hybrids looked a little more like ordinary wild boar again, the visible pig traits fading out. But the reproductive engine underneath, the one advantage that actually mattered for a population trying to explode into empty territory, stayed locked firmly in place. By 2018, that same domestic genetic signature had been detected outside the evacuated area entirely. The hybrids weren't just surviving inside the zone. They were spreading beyond it. Some of the hybrids gave themselves away visually, at least for a generation or two. A patch of pale, unboar-like skin along the belly, ears a little too floppy for a wild animal, litters noticeably larger than anything a purebred sow would carry. Researchers studying the phenomenon described something close to a genetic eraser running in reverse. Each new generation of breeding washed the visible pig traits further out of the bloodline, until the hybrids became almost indistinguishable from ordinary wild boar to anyone without a lab. But the trait that mattered most, the ability to breed on a domestic pig's calendar instead of a wild boar's, never washed out at all. It stayed embedded in the maternal line, quietly outperforming its wild counterparts, one litter at a time. The scientists who documented it were careful to note that Fukushima wasn't a freak, isolated case either. Anywhere in the world where escaped domestic pigs meet wild boar populations, from feral hog country in the American South to wild boar herds across rural Europe and Australia, the same hybridization and the same reproductive edge could theoretically take hold. Fukushima had simply provided the perfect, undisturbed laboratory conditions to catch it happening in real time. That's why wildlife biologists outside Japan started paying close attention to a story that, on the surface, had nothing to do with their own countries. Feral pig populations are already a multi-billion-dollar problem across parts of the United States, Australia, and Europe, tearing up farmland, outcompeting native species, and proving almost impossible to fully eradicate once established. If a hybrid lineage with a genuine reproductive advantage can emerge from a single accidental crossing event inside one Japanese exclusion zone, the same mechanism could, in theory, be quietly accelerating feral pig booms anywhere domestic and wild populations already overlap. Fukushima didn't just document a strange local phenomenon, it handed researchers a rare, real-time case study in exactly how fast an invasive hybrid can take shape once the right two populations meet with nobody around to stop them. Think about what that actually means. This wasn't simply a story about wild animals reclaiming abandoned land. It was a story about two separate populations, one wild and one domestic, meeting in a vacuum nobody planned for, and producing something new, something faster to reproduce than either parent species on its own. Something built, entirely by accident, to fill empty ground as quickly as biology would allow. And empty ground was exactly what it got. By the time officials began preparing to reopen parts of the exclusion zone in 2017, 6 years after the disaster, the towns inside it no longer resembled anything the former residents remembered. In Namie, wild boar wandered the middle of residential streets in broad daylight, the same streets where children used to walk to school. In Tomioka, boars had moved directly into abandoned homes, using empty houses as denning sites the way they might use a hollow log or a thicket. University of Georgia researcher James Beasley spent years fitting boar with GPS collars to track exactly how far this new comfort with human spaces extended, and his team recorded animals denning inside a former elementary school, using the covered playground as shelter from the rain, the same way a wild sow might use a rocky overhang. In Okuma and Futaba, the two towns closest to the reactors themselves, boar tracks crossed straight through what used to be front gardens, undisturbed, day after day. Beasley's team described watching entire family groups, a mature sow and a season's worth of young, move through a residential intersection in the middle of the afternoon with the same unhurried confidence a herd of deer might show in an empty national park. A local hunter named Shoichiro Sakamoto, who led Tomioka's animal control team, spent his days laying traps in front yards and behind schools, working through neighborhoods that used to need nothing more dangerous than a mail carrier. His mornings started the same way for years, driving into a town with no other cars on the road, no traffic lights worth stopping for, weeds pushing up through asphalt that used to be swept every week. He would walk streets that still had children's bicycles rusting against the side of a house, check a trap, reset a trap, and move on to the next block, alone, patrolling a town built for thousands. It was, by any measure, one of the strangest jobs the disaster ever created. Professional wildlife control for a town whose official population was 0. Hunting teams like his had killed roughly 800 boar in the area in a matter of months, and it barely made a dent. The animals had stopped being afraid. That's the detail that unsettled researchers the most. Boar that grow up around humans usually keep their distance, flee at the first sign of movement, treat people as a threat worth avoiding on sight. The generation of boar born and raised inside the exclusion zone had never learned that lesson. They had grown up in towns with no threats in them at all. By the time people started trying to move back in, the boar had no instinct telling them to leave. Officials began reporting boar attacks on the returning residents themselves, animals that no longer scattered at the sight of a human, because, for 6 straight years, a human had simply never shown up. The financial damage climbed alongside the fear. Crop damage across the region approached $1 million. Fields replanted by returning farmers torn up again within weeks. And underneath every one of these numbers sat a problem nobody could fully solve. The boar weren't just aggressive and unafraid anymore. They were radioactive. Hunting inside the zone was never as simple as sending in more people with rifles. Every hunter working the contaminated areas had to wear dosimeters and follow strict daily radiation exposure limits, meaning even the most determined trapper could only spend so many hours inside the worst-hit neighborhoods before being pulled out for the day, whether the job was finished or not. Every single carcass had to be tested for cesium contamination before anyone could decide whether it needed to be incinerated, buried, or, in the rare cases where levels came back low enough, released for consumption. And the money to fund all of this kept getting harder to secure. Even as culling costs climbed toward $2 million a year at the program's peak, government subsidies supporting evacuees living outside the prefecture were being quietly reduced, part of a broader push to declare the disaster officially behind Japan and showcase the region's recovery, especially with the Tokyo Olympics approaching in 2020. Local officials were left managing a genuinely worsening wildlife crisis with a shrinking budget. At the exact moment national attention was moving on to other things. Wild boar are foragers. They dig for roots, mushrooms, insects, anything buried in contaminated soil, and mushrooms in particular tend to concentrate radioactive cesium far more efficiently than most other plants. Boar that had spent years foraging across the most contaminated parts of the zone were carrying cesium-137 levels in their muscle tissue up to 300 times higher than Japan's food safety standard. That single fact turned population control into a logistical nightmare nobody had budgeted for. You cannot sell radioactive boar meat. You cannot process it through a normal slaughterhouse. You cannot even bury an unlimited number of carcasses without turning contaminated remains into another long-term hazard. The nearby city of Nihonmatsu dug 3 mass graves specifically to handle the overflow, built to hold 1,800 boar carcasses combined. Within a few years, all 3 were full, and the culling hadn't stopped. Only one incinerator in the entire region was certified to burn contaminated carcasses safely. It could process 3 boar a day. At that rate, clearing a single year's cull would have taken over a decade, and the boar kept breeding faster than the incinerator could keep pace. Hideki Tachiya, the mayor of the nearby town of Soma, said what the region needed most wasn't more traps or more hunters working overtime. It was a real, coordinated strategy, because somewhere underneath the fear and the radiation readings sat a genuine loss. Wild boar meat had always been a delicacy in this part of Japan. Now an entire local food tradition, generations old, had been made permanently untouchable by an accident that had nothing to do with the boar themselves. Before 2011, hunting wild boar in the mountains above Fukushima wasn't just pest control. It was a seasonal tradition passed down across generations, tied to a specific dish, inoshishi nabe, a rich hot pot built around wild boar meat, simmered through the cold months in kitchens across the region. Local hunters took quiet pride in supplying it. Restaurants built entire winter menus around it. That chain, from forest to hunter to kitchen to table, had existed for longer than anyone could remember, and the meltdown severed it in a single afternoon. What's left now is hunting with no reward waiting at the end of it, killing animals not to eat them or sell them, but simply to slow down a population that refuses to stop growing on its own. If you're the kind of person who finds it fascinating how quickly an ecosystem can flip once humans step back, even briefly, stay with this one, because the story is about to get stranger still. Subscribe if you want to see exactly where else on Earth this same pattern has already played out, because Fukushima was not the first place it happened. It happened before, 32 years earlier, in a different country, after a different kind of nuclear accident, with almost exactly the same result. In April 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine suffered a full core meltdown, releasing roughly 400 times more radioactive fallout than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Close to 116,000 people were evacuated from the surrounding region. Officials declared a 1,000 square mile exclusion zone, roughly the size of Yosemite National Park, and expected to find, decades later, a dead landscape. What they found instead was one of the densest wildlife populations left in Europe. Gray wolves inside the Chernobyl exclusion zone now live at population densities up to 7 times higher than in comparable protected reserves outside it. Elk, roe deer, rabbit, lynx, wild boar, and even brown bear have expanded back into territory they hadn't occupied in generations. Researchers who have spent decades studying the zone have put the finding in blunt terms. Whatever damage the meltdown did to this land, it was nothing compared to the decades of farming, hunting, road building, and development that came before it. Removing the fallout could never undo what removing the people did. The parallels went deeper than population counts. Princeton researchers fitted Chernobyl's wolves with GPS collars wired to radiation dosimeters, and found the animals absorbing daily radiation doses more than 6 times the legal safety limit set for humans, every single day, for their entire lives. And yet the wolves weren't dying off or failing to reproduce. Genetic sequencing later suggested some Chernobyl wolf populations may even be developing mutations linked to greater resistance to cancer, A kind of evolutionary shortcut nobody planned for and nobody fully understands yet. It's the same eerie pattern that would later turn up in Fukushima's boar and rat snakes. Radiation that should have thinned a population instead seemed to barely touch it, while removing humans from the equation did more to reshape the landscape than the meltdown itself ever managed to. Japan didn't design an experiment when it evacuated Fukushima. It stumbled into a repeat of one that had already run its course in Ukraine a generation earlier, with an outcome that should have been entirely predictable to anyone paying attention. Take 150,000 people and their hunting rifles, their farms, their fences, their cars, and their noise, out of a landscape, and within 2 years, something is going to move into the space they left behind. It just depends on what happened to be standing at the tree line when the barricades went up. Nobody released the Boars, everyone else just left. Back at his ranch, 14 kilometers from the crippled reactors, Masami Yoshizawa was living through his own smaller version of the same story. Radiation readings on his land measured roughly 10 times the government's safe benchmark for human habitation. He stayed anyway. Over the following years, the herd he had refused to abandon grew back from a handful of survivors to more than 300 head of cattle, some of them taken in from neighboring ranches whose owners had given up entirely. His cows could never be sold as beef again. Every one of them would live out a natural life and die of old age on contaminated pasture, a fate that made no economic sense whatsoever, and Yoshizawa didn't seem to care. He wasn't running a business anymore. He had turned Ranch of Hope into something closer to a monument, standing in a field, to exactly what the disaster had actually cost. Some of his cattle developed strange white spots on their hides over the years, a change vets who visited the ranch still can't fully explain. Yoshizawa had his own radiation exposure tested more than 20 times over the following decade. So far, no major health problems have turned up. He is, by his own account, still waiting to see what the land eventually decides to do to him. Visitors who make the trip out to Ranch of Hope, and a handful of journalists still do every year, describe the same striking image. A herd of cattle grazing calmly in the shadow of a nuclear plant that most of the world assumed had been sealed off from all life the moment it failed. It's a smaller, quieter version of exactly what was happening a few kilometers away with the boar, minus the chaos. One stubborn man decided a contaminated field was still worth protecting. An entire species of wild pig decided the same thing, on a much larger scale, without anyone asking it to. Scientists studying the wildlife of the exclusion zone were bracing for a similar verdict on a much larger scale, and what they found surprised almost everyone involved. In 2016 and again in 2018, a research team including Colorado State University veterinary student Kelly Cunningham entered the zone to collect genetic samples from wild boar and rat snakes living deep inside the most contaminated areas. The expectation going in was damage, mutation, some visible sign, at the cellular level, of what years of radiation exposure does to a living animal. Instead, the team found something close to nothing. The boar and the snakes they sampled showed almost no measurable genetic damage at all. Cunningham described walking through the abandoned towns as something closer to stepping into a place frozen mid-motion. Everything still exactly where it had been left. Nobody around to use any of it anymore. And the animals living inside that frozen town looked, by every genetic measure the team could run, completely healthy. That's the twist sitting at the center of this entire story. The radiation didn't cripple the boar. It didn't slow them down, weaken them, or thin the population the way a disaster is supposed to. The only thing it did was make them impossible to eat. Everything else the meltdown was supposed to destroy, the boar simply adapted straight around, and then multiplied straight through. Some parts of the exclusion zone have reopened since 2017, piece by piece, as decontamination crews strip away topsoil and radiation readings slowly drop toward acceptable levels. But reopening a town on paper and repopulating it in reality turned out to be two entirely different problems. Government surveys of former residents have repeatedly found that more than half say they have no intention of ever moving back, and radiation is no longer the only reason they give. Houses left empty for over a decade have deteriorated past the point of easy repair. Gardens have been dug up so many times by foraging boar that some returning residents have simply stopped replanting them. Researchers tracking the region's wildlife have started describing the situation with a phrase that would have sounded absurd back in 2011. A human-wildlife conflict zone, in a country that spent a century treating wild boar as nothing more than a manageable, minor agricultural nuisance. Even now, more than a decade on, boar remain one of the single biggest practical obstacles to full resettlement, arguably a bigger daily obstacle for returning families than the radiation readings themselves, which have fallen steadily across most reopened areas. You can decontaminate soil. You can measure it, publish the number, and point to a chart showing it trending downward year after year. There is no equivalent chart for convincing several thousand wild boar that a neighborhood they have called home for over a decade now belongs to somebody else again. Scientists studying both Fukushima and Chernobyl are careful to note that neither story is actually finished. Populations that surge this fast inside a vacuum don't necessarily stay stable forever, and some ecologists expect eventual crashes as food sources thin out or disease spreads through such dense, unmanaged numbers. Nobody has a confident timeline for when, or if, either exclusion zone eventually settles into something resembling equilibrium. For now, the honest answer to how long you'd need to wait it out is simple. Nobody knows yet, and the decades since Chernobyl's own evacuation still haven't produced one. So what actually happened here? Not the version people assume when they hear a headline like this one. The version where a government agency makes a deliberate, reckless decision to unleash thousands of wild boar onto ruined land as some kind of ecological experiment. That version never happened, not in Fukushima, not anywhere. What actually happened is quieter than that, and in a lot of ways more unsettling. Nobody chose this outcome. Nobody signed off on it. A government issued an evacuation order to protect human lives from an invisible threat, and in the 2-year gap between that decision and anyone even beginning to understand its side effects, an animal that had always lived quietly in the surrounding hills simply walked into the vacuum and never left. That is the real lesson sitting underneath every statistic in this story. You don't need to release a predator, or a competitor, or an invader into a damaged landscape to watch it get overrun. You only need to remove the one species that had been holding everything else in balance, even by accident, even through nothing more deliberate than farming and hunting and fences and noise. Take that species out of the equation, anywhere on Earth, and something else is already waiting at the tree line to take its place. Fukushima doesn't prove that nuclear disasters are secretly good for wildlife, whatever the more sensational version of this story wants you to believe. It proves something colder than that. It proves that humans had been suppressing this outcome the entire time, everywhere, all along, just by being there. And that reframes the entire premise a story like this one usually leans on. It's tempting to imagine some government office making a calculated, almost villainous decision, weighing risk against reward, and choosing to gamble a ruined landscape on thousands of animals on purpose. It's a cleaner story that way, a story with a decision-maker to point at and blame. The real version has no villain in it at all, which might be exactly why it's harder to look away from. Nobody in any ministry sat in a room and chose wild boar as the future of the Fukushima countryside. A wall of water hit a power plant. A government did the only thing it reasonably could to protect its citizens, and biology filled in the rest of the story entirely on its own, indifferent to anyone's intentions, running the same experiment it has quietly run in every other patch of land humans have ever abandoned in a hurry. There are two ways people tend to land on this story once they hear the whole thing. Some call it one of the most remarkable, unplanned rewilding events in modern history. Hard proof that nature doesn't need permission or a management plan to reclaim what it lost. Just an opening and enough time to use it. Others hear the exact same set of facts and land somewhere much darker, a warning about how fragile the balance actually is, how little time it takes, how a landscape that took decades to farm and settle can slip entirely out of human hands in under 24 months, and how much harder it is to take back than it ever was to lose in the first place. Both camps, it's worth noting, are looking at the exact same set of facts. Nobody disputes the numbers. Nobody disputes that the boar moved in, bred faster than anyone predicted, and made large stretches of the zone functionally uninhabitable, for the people who used to call it home. What separates the two readings isn't the evidence. It's what you were already inclined to believe about nature, about disaster, and about how much control humans actually have over either one, long before you ever heard the word Fukushima. Maybe both readings are true at the same time. A rancher stood in an empty radioactive town and decided some things were worth saving no matter what they cost him. A wild animal that had lived quietly in the hills for centuries found an open door and, without any plan at all, walked through it and made an entire valley its own. Neither of them asked Japan's permission. Neither of them needed it. That's worth remembering the next time a headline promises you a story about an animal invasion, a deliberate release, a plan gone wrong. More often than not, there was no plan at all. There was only a door left open a little longer than anyone intended, and something out there patient enough and hungry enough to notice. So here's the question worth sitting with. If the place you lived in emptied out tomorrow, if every fence came down and every road went quiet, and nobody was left to push back against whatever came out of the tree line, how long do you think it would actually take? Not the version that sounds dramatic, the real number. Because in Fukushima, the answer turned out to be 2 years, and nobody released a single thing to make it happen.